Sometimes there's things in our life that change the courses of our life. If you're blessed enough that that be an interaction with God that changes the course of your life, then it's something that you never forget and you want to share with the world. What I'm about to share is exactly that. Because this isn't the first time I've gone through the book of Malachi. Many years ago, I was going through the book of Malachi with a group of men from the church, and shortly after I'd gone through Malachi 3, there was a period in my life where I hit severe financial hardship. I did not think this was an accident as far as the timing goes. God was doing a thing in me, and it changed my life. I grew up really as a poor kid. It was kind of an odd upbringing because we grew up in a wealthy city, but we were the small population of people that were extremely poor. So it was tough growing up as a poor kid amongst a bunch of rich kids. And my mom did a good job. We always had enough, but we never had enough. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, there was always plenty, but there was never plenty. I don't know if there's a better way to describe it. If you've grown up that way, you know exactly what I'm talking about. As I became a young man, and I didn't have, my parents didn't pay for me to go to college or give me money in a trust or anything like that, obviously, at all. So most of my young adult life was really in a kind of a lower income level. Now, there was a point in my life in 2009 where I was a single father and I was a teacher. And one Sunday morning, I woke up and I was heading off to church. And I stopped by the post office because I lived out in the country, living in a farmhouse, and they didn't deliver mail to my house, so you had to go to the post office and get it. So it was a Sunday on my way to church. I stopped to get the mail, and right when I saw this letter in a yellow envelope, I knew exactly what it was, that was my layoff letter. Once I saw it was in a yellow envelope and it was from the school district I taught for, I knew I was getting laid off. And this was during the Great Recession. This was that year, 40,000 teachers nationwide were laid off, and I was one of them. My kids were, I think, 6 and 8, so they obviously didn't work. There's no income coming in there, so that was 100% of my income. So as I drove to church, I started to panic. I started to hyperventilate. I actually had to pull over and call my mom because my fingers and toes were getting numb, and I was getting a little lightheaded because I couldn't quite breathe right. And as I got calmed down, I went ahead and went to church, and I sat in the parking lot, and I heard them singing inside, and I couldn't go in. I couldn't worship. I just couldn't do it. So I waited till they were done singing, so I could hear they were done singing, and then I went in, and I don't even know what the preacher preached on that day. I went through the book of Job personally there, but anyhow, they passed the plate. And I remember thinking, there's no way I can tithe. Like, I can count on two hands the hundreds of dollars I have to last me for what at the time I believe was going to be a solid year. And it ended up being a year before I would get a job, because every school district was either laying off or had a hiring freeze, one or the other. Nobody in the state of Missouri was hiring at all. And this was August. They would have laid me off in like April. I maybe would have had a chance to look, but they laid me off in August. So, school started in a couple weeks. Nobody was hiring. And I knew nobody would hire for at least a year. So as they passed the plate, I thought to myself, there's no way I could tithe. Like, there's just, again, I could count the hundreds of dollars I have on two hands to last me a year with two children, with no sort of lead or anything in sight. Of course, I'm still in that first morning stage of it. And so I drove home, and I got halfway home, and I was reminded of this verse, Malachi 3, starting at 8. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and prove me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open up for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. And in that moment, I realized I had messed up really bad. And I turned around, I did a U-turn, and I drove back to the church, and I gave a tenth of everything I had. And I committed at that moment that any time that somebody handed me $1, I was going to give a dime to the church. If somebody handed me $100, I was going to give $10 to the church. Because I needed that promise to rely on as I feared and grew anxious and worried. I leaned on that because the most beautiful thing that it says in here, if you look at 10, it says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse that there may be food in my house, and prove me now. Now it's test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts. And Jesus said, do not test God. But this says, test him in this. Like, it's the one place in the Bible where it says, you can test me in this test me. Because it's about money. It's really where a person's money goes is where their heart is, period. You can't hide where your heart is if you look at a person's money. And to be in a state of fear like that, to realize that, you have less than $1,000 to last you for a year with 2 children, to somehow commit to that means you had to lean on that promise. But the great thing about leaning on a promise is if it comes from God, it is a promise. He's not going to fail you. So, not to get into a lot of detail of how the year went down, but it was a hard year. I did not work until the following summer. I finally got another job. Now, I worked. I did odds and ends. I guess I would call it I hustled, so to say, to do whatever I could to make it work. But by the end of the year, when I finally did my taxes, even though it felt like I suffered throughout the whole year, I ended up making more money than I did if I had a job. And I can't explain that with math or physics. I just can't do it. But when you looked at the numbers, I made more money without a job somehow. And I was at that point, God said, test me in this. So I did. And he proved me in it to be true. So when it comes to the tithes and offering, I had a friend one time, I was sharing a story like that, and because he was suffering financially, and he said, well, I can't afford to tithe. And I'm going to say, you can't afford not to tithe. You have not, because you are not willing to trust in God. That period of time was a tough time, and I got through it. I learned a lot in that process. I grew a lot. I matured a lot in my finances and with God. And from that moment, I was committed to it. And my whole life, I lived where if I needed 100, I had 90. And I finally, for the first time, was living a life where if I needed 100, I had 110. And God just continuously faithful. Even now that I'm married, when my wife worries about money, I always remind her, well, do we tithe? Well, if the answer is yes, then you have nothing to worry about. Now, when I became the head of school of a small Christian school in Johnson County, Missouri, they were failing financially. And I remember looking at the books. When I first got there, I had an office, but there was a fold-up table with a bunch of boxes filled with files on it. And that's all I had. And I had a telephone. And I went out in the hall and I pulled a chair out in the hall. That actually ended up being my chair for 3 years. But I pulled it from out in the hall, and I sat there, and I was surrounded by papers just trying to figure out what is going on in this place. And as I went through the budget, I crunched it like so many different ways. I spent weeks like, well, what if we got rid of this? Or what if we did that? Or what if we did that? And no matter how I did it, we were always at least $100,000 short. Now, that's a lot of money for a tiny school. It's probably nothing for a giant school, but we were a tiny school. That was a lot of money. That was a fifth of our budget. And no matter what I did, it just wasn't there. And I said out loud, I sat there and I said out loud, this is impossible. And right at that moment, I heard God say, well, of course it is for you. For you, it is impossible. And I realized what it is I had to do. And I went to the board meeting and I told them that this is impossible. It won't work financially. The only way that this will possibly work is if the school tithes. I believed in it. I've experienced it. If we tithe, we'll succeed. If we don't tithe, we will fail. It was that simple. There was no confusion about it for me. It was either you tithe and you succeed, or you don't tithe and you fail. Now, later on, half the board told me that they thought I was crazy, because it's hard to say we're $100,000 short. I recommend we give away $50,000. That doesn't make a lot of sense to people. But we did, and we were very faithful to it. And I didn't have any relationships with churches, so I started, I picked out about 38 churches in Johnson County and just started forming relationships and sending them money, which is how a lot of these relationships were formed that I had with these pastors who then, we've made plenty of episodes on then they consumed the sacrifice of the altar, but I was doing my part. I was doing my part as the leader of that school to show God, here, I believe in you. We're going to trust in you for our finances. And what happened next, I might get a little teary-eyed when I share this story. Usually if I get kind of teary-eyed, it's because I'm thinking about the love of God, and it just fills me with joy. So I'm just giving the heads up that once we started tithing, we got to the very first paycheck, and we were $6,000 short. And the night before payroll, and it comes out automatically at like 10 in the morning the next morning, and I just remember thinking, God, I know you're going to come through. I know you're going to come through. I don't know how, but I know you're going to come through. And the next morning I got up, and he had not come through. We were $6,000 short, and that was it. And I stood there, and I was kind of in my office, and I thought to myself, God, like, you said test me in this, and I did, and you're not going to come through? Like, is this a lie? Like, what is this, God, that you're doing here? Like, you said test me, I'm testing you, and you failed me. And I was angry about it. And I walked out in the hall into the gymnasium where all the kids are coming in, and this little girl, little second grade girl, walks up to me and hands me an envelope. And she says, my daddy told me to give this to you. And I opened up, there was $6,000, just an anonymous donation that God put that on that guy's heart the night before to donate exactly what we needed. And I sat there and I sobbed, because who am I? Who am I to doubt God? Like, who am I? I was so ashamed of myself in that moment, and I never forgot it. And what I can share with you in my 4 years at that school was we never stopped. Like, we learned that lesson early on, and we never stopped. We never ceased. And there was even a point where there was a pastor in a town of Holden, and he had money. And every now and then when I needed money, I always went out, and what my board president referred to as I shook the bushes. And I remember going to him, this is a few years later, and we were about $10,000 short. And I just asked him, hey, you wouldn't happen to have $10,000 you can give the school, do you? And of course he didn't. But he asked me, well, what are you going to do if you don't have it? Because I said, well, I need to have it by Friday, because if I'm $10,000 short, I got to pay all the teachers. We've never missed a payroll since I've been there. And he said, well, what are you going to do if you don't have it? And I said, I looked him confidently. I didn't even question. I was like, well, of course we'll have it. We've been tithing, like, of course we'll have it. I don't know where it's going to come from, but of course we're going to have it. And then on that Thursday, there was $10,000 donated to us. And that Sunday, somebody sent it to me, a recording of that pastor's sermon on how that blew him out of the water. That, essentially what I'm telling him is, I'm saying, you know how hard it is to need $10,000, but you give away like $4,000, knowing you need 10, but you give away 4 because you're trusting in God. You know how hard that is? It takes a lot of faith. It takes a lot of faith. And I don't believe there's many spiritual leaders out there that have that much faith. I don't believe there's many Christians that have that much faith to sit there in faith and think, I need $10,000, but my tithe for this particular period of time is $4,000. Let me just give it away because I need 10. But God says, test me in this. It's so incredibly important. And you know what? That entire 4 years I was at that school, there was maybe, at 24 pay periods a year times 4, there was maybe 4 or 5 times we had it. So, almost 100 paychecks, maybe 4 or 5 of them we had. At the other times, we were always $6,000 to $10,000 short, but God always came through. Always. By the 4th year, I didn't worry at all. I wasn't worried at all. We were extremely short, and I just would say, well, I'm not worried at all. I don't know. God might just drop a bag of money on the porch. I quit questioning what it is he was going to do because I was filled with faith and no longer filled with fear. And that's really what it's all about, because where your heart is, there's your money. That's why God says, test me in this. It's a test. It's a test for you, but it's also a test for him. It's to show you, it's almost like you're testing him while you're being tested. We're going to spend a couple episodes on this. I had to share that story because when it comes to the tithe, I don't mess around. I have lived this out. I have seen it. I have gone from being a kid in poverty to raising children that are not in poverty, not because of anything I did, but because of the power of the tithe that God pours into that and the way that he blesses it. And the church, when you see churches consuming the sacrifice of the altar, it's because they don't trust God in that. Why does God want you to have this? Why does he want you to do this? So there's food in his house. That's why he wants you to do it. It's about, going all the way back. We talked about this whole time. What did Jesus say he expected you to do? Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, take care of the orphans and the widows. There must be food in his house, not take care of yourself. Not sit there and say, I gave a darn good speech this week. I deserve hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's not what it's about. It's about laying down your finances to God. It's the sacrifice at the altar. When you put your tithes and offering, there's about 100% chance that those people with those plates will bring them up to the altar. It's laying down the sacrifices of the altar, and it's being consumed. And people are just taking it, and they're eating it, and they're consuming it, and they're making themselves fat off of it. But you still have to do it. Pick wisely where you send the money. We went from sending our money to about 39 churches to about 4 because we learned the hearts of the leaders of those churches. Because when you look at where the money goes, that is where their heart is. That same church that I was talking about in Holden, I remember going to that pastor one time saying, we've tithed. Over the 4 years, we probably gave, $15,000 to that church. And I remember going to the pastor, is there, another time, and I said, is there anything you can do to help the school? And, can the church help? And he literally went to his board and said, well, because they were like, no, give them nothing. Because they wanted to support their local school and not the Christian school. So they said, no, we need to support the local school. Let's give them nothing. And he said, well, what if, even though we've given them $10,000 to $15,000, and he said, well, what if we just gave them what they're giving us? And their answer was no. Because there's not a heart of wanting to feed the hungry or clothe the naked or teach children about Jesus Christ. It's a heart to become popular. Well, what can we do to make our church more well-known in the community? And what can we do to fill our pews and, in the end, make more money? We're going to spend a long time on Malachi 3, really 8 through 12, because there's more to this. Not only does he open up the windows of heaven and pour out such a blessing to you that there's not enough room to receive it, but he also says in 11, and I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground, nor shall the vine fail to bear fruit for you in the field, says the Lord of hosts. Because for us, it's about money. It's about money. We value it more than in most other things in the world. And if we're willing to lay it down to God, to lay it down, that's faith, to lay it down, to say, you know what, God, I am short $10,000, so I'm going to give you 4. I'm just laying it down. I trust you. God sees that. It's hard to lay down your money. Jesus Christ, when he came across the rich young man, essentially told him, unless you can give this up, you can't follow me, because it's faithfully laying it down, and churches just aren't able to do that, and a lot of humans aren't able to do that, or just Christians in general. But for God, it's about seeing the trust of his children, of those that he had created, those that call him Father. It's seeing that they trust in your Father. It's trusting in your Father. And when your Father sees that you trust him, he provides for you, is the promise. But he also rebukes the devourer for your sake. That is huge, and that's what we're going to talk. I mean, that is huge. And we're going to talk about that as well. So love to hear your thoughts on all this. If you're not tithing, tithe. If you're concerned about where to tithe because you don't trust churches, seek them out. There's awesome ministries. We tithe to a prison ministry in Johnson County called Stand in the Gap. I mean, they are workers. They're on the front line working in the field, taking care of the prisoners. We also provide to Christian schools, things like that. There's places to make sure that there's food in his house. If you don't trust the church, don't give them their money. But do find a church that you do trust and give them your money, then give them your money. Because if they're feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, taking care of the widows and the orphans, then they're doing the right thing. They're doing what God has asked them to do with those resources. Love to hear your thoughts on it. Put in the comments below. If you like this video, click like and subscribe. If you feel called to support this channel to Patreon, that link is also below. But the most important part of this channel is we take prayer requests, so never hesitate to send that in. Thank you for watching this episode of God, Family, and Guns. And as always, love God, love your family, and love God.